Perfect. Okay, well, hello everyone. Good morning for some and good afternoon for others. My name is Joëlle Ferzli. I am the co-founder and the CEO of Tribute, a responsible retail and cross-disciplinary platform based here in Washington, DC, and welcome to The Good Chat. The Good Chat started in May 2020, an aftermath of COVID-19. We wanted to continue to create thoughtful and intentional conversation on fashion and textiles, and to continue to encourage critical thinking and continue to engage with our community. The Good Chat is a monthly event, and today we're talking about textiles. To understand the complex history and complexity of this material, I'm so pleased today to have Camille and Brewer, Chloe Bensael, and Roxana Jeffen here with us. They will share their research, their work, and their thought, and help us better understand how do materials carry meaning, and how do artists amplify and animate this meaning. I know it's a really extensive topic, and we'll do our best to cover the important point in 45 minutes or so. Our format is a bit different today. So I'll ask a couple of questions, and then each panelist will be sharing a presentation. Before we start, just some quick housekeeping to our participants. Welcome, everyone. Please, we'll ask you to remain on mute throughout the discussions. You can chat, comment, and ask questions in the chat sections. And if you want to ask it live, you can also do that. Just mention it in your comments. We have assigned some time at the end of the discussion to answer them. The conversation will be recorded and uploaded later on our YouTube page, which I invite you to subscribe to. And I will share the link on the chat box. Once again, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. And without further ado, I will let first each panelist introduce themselves. Chloe, we can start with you.
Hi, my name is Chloe Bensael, as Joëlle mentioned. I'm an artist based both in Washington, D.C. and in Paris. I work primarily with textiles and tapestry. I've been working with the National Tapestry Workshop here in Paris for a couple of years now, and I work mostly around themes relating to language and how we interpret and live language and stories through textiles and textile performances.
Thank you, Chloe. Camille?
Hello, everyone. My name is Camille Ann Brewer. I am a hand weaver based here in Detroit, Michigan. Most recently from Washington, D.C. as the inaugural curator of the Contemporary Art Department at the Textile Museum. I'm a weaver of, I just counted recently, 37 years and counting. So I've been at this a while.
Thanks, Camille. And Roxana?
Hi, yes, I'm Roxana Alger-Geffen. I am a multidisciplinary artist living here in Washington, D.C. I use a lot of textiles and fiber in my work, but also lots of other materials, often found objects or family objects as part of my work.
Thank you all for being here. So I'll start with a very straightforward way to define textile. They define it as any filament, fibers, or yarn that can be made into fabric or cloth, and the resulting material itself. Textiles are everywhere. They are omnipresent and interwoven into the private and public practices of every culture, both formal and informal, quotidian and ceremonial. It is one of the most interesting functional art forms whose history is as rich as the known civilizations that scholars have studied. So my first question for all of you is, what does textile mean to you, and how did you develop an interest in textile? Camille, we can start with you. Oh, I think you have to unmute yourself.
Growing up surrounded by relatives who were engaged in textile construction practices, but men and women. I didn't think anything of it, and began my art career as a jewelry designer, copper primarily, silver jewelry. And it was in undergraduate school where we all have to take an elective course that I took weaving. And it just called my name, and it has sustained me for the last over 35 years, as I mentioned earlier. So I wouldn't have thought that when I fell into that vortex, but here I am.
Okay, and Roxana?
So I think, I think I was initially interested in textiles as a kid. I'm often, I think the sort of focus of my interest is in the way that textiles relate to our bodies, that they are often, that there's a deep intimacy about textiles, and that we wear them close to our skin. They're sort of protective, but also offer this kind of constant tactile experience with them throughout our lives. And I was very interested in the Little House on the Prairie books as a kid, and because of I was just fascinated by the long descriptions of going from raw material to object that takes place in those books, of both carpentry and also sewing, but sewing figures very largely in that story. And so I was very interested in the idea of coming from this raw material to this structured protection, or part of identity, or and their relationship to these objects that they were making. So I think that sort of.
Okay. So it's all, both of you, it's linked also to a childhood, something that started with a childhood. What about you, Chloe?
Yeah, I guess I won't be that original, but I grew up in a family of immigrants in France, and then in the United States, from North Africa, and also of the Jewish faith. And because of the narratives and kind of the inherent trauma of those narratives, we usually didn't speak about the history or the narrative. And so my way of knowing like who I was and where I came from was through like rugs on the floor, or like these little traces of materials that my grandfather or my family like had with them. And so I think there was always the sense that to know one's history is to experience it through textiles, and also that like softness that it brings. And then I also spent like a good part of my adolescence peeling through fashion magazines and kind of imagining the power of like reinventing the self also through textiles. So that simultaneous like storyteller and then like reinventor, I think was like really fascinating.
Mm-hmm. So to understand better, I think we all need to see some visuals, and you both have three very interesting point of view. So I think it's a good time now to kind of share these presentations. And Chloe, I would like to start with you. Okay. If you can share yours.
All right, let's do this. How do I do this again? Hold on.
So you should have a share screen button.
Oh yes, got it. Okay. So, oh, you disabled participant screen sharing. Oh. It says.
Oh, okay. God, man, this technology and me. Okay, can you send it to me quickly, and I'll do that. Okay.
Yep.
Sure. And in the meantime, we can start with.
Again, my name's Camille Ambrewer. I'm based in Detroit, Michigan, Motor City, and home to the Sock and Fox people who would run out of here to Wisconsin, and then ran out of Wisconsin to Iowa, Nebraska, and Kansas. I sit on their land. I'm going to read, next slide, please. I'm going to read a segment from this book, Conversations with Ogotemeli, an elder in the Dogon group in northern Africa. At sunrise on the appointed day, the seventh ancestor spat out 80 threads of cotton. These he distributed between his upper and lower teeth, which acted as a weaver's reed. In this way, he made the threads of a warp. By opening and shutting his jaws, the spirit caused the threads of the warp to make the movements required in weaving. His whole face took part, his nose studs serving as the block, while the studs of his lower lip were the shuttle. As the threads crossed and uncrossed, the two tips of the spirit's forked tongue pushed the thread of the web back and forth, and the web took shape from his mouth and in the breath of the word. The words that the spirit uttered filled all. The words were woven in the threads as formed part and parcel of the cloth. They were the cloth, and the cloth was the word. Next slide. So, looking at textiles as an ancient practice, the loom is the first machine produced or manipulated, a machine manipulated to produce another product. So we're talking about a practice that goes back thousands of years. Next, I want to talk about two exhibitions that I've seen I saw in 2019, so almost 2 years ago for both of them, one of them 18 months ago, where textiles take center. And I'm curious as to how textiles are presented within a fine art conversation versus craft conversation in a museum context. This show, Taking a Thread for a Walk, was presented at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in the Philip Johnson Galleries. It recently closed, just closed this last January. This exhibition was installed right in the heart of the MoMA edifice, right in the center of the museum. And it's interesting to note that the exhibition was organized by the Department of Architecture and Design. There's a loom set up in the galleries. There were films of a weaver passing the shuttle back and forth. The exhibition noted the role of textiles during the mid-1900s, primarily the 1940s to the 1960s, as a creative discipline, one closely aligned with the practices of architecture, industrial design, drawing, and sculpture. After World War II, many art academies and art departments at colleges and universities championed experimental learning and using these craft techniques to build art objects. The exhibition featured artworks from the museum's permanent collection, which included ancient textiles. Next slide, Joelle. Early 20th century design work and work exploring different industrial materials and production methods. There were also graphite drawings of textile-like images included in the exhibition, which I found very interesting. And again, most of the work highlighted this change from a utilitarian cloth into an art object. Next slide. Annie Albers on the right. Next slide. So the same year, an exhibition was presented here at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Detroit called Unfurled, Support Surfaces 1966 to 1976. And the show featured 12 artists who comprised the French art movement Supports Surfaces. And you see here on the left, ephemera from their newsletter was included in the exhibition, and they're providing illustrations on how to construct a support for their painting. We see knitting, we see weaving, we see crochet. Those words were never used in the exhibition. Textile was never used as a term in the exhibition. Fabric was never used. Cloth was never used. It's interesting how textiles were presented. Next slide. Again, the artists lived in the south of France and produced work. They had an interest in the materiality of their paintings, the uses of color, and expansive ideas of what constitutes a painting. The group's name refers to their attempt to strip a painting down to its most essential components. Surface alludes to the canvas of a painting, while support refers to the stretcher bars that give painting its structural integrity. The group started a journal, Peinture Cahier d'Arique, to discuss and debate their ideas publicly. The work was produced and exhibited in public spaces outside museum and gallery institutions. Next slide. So this work was produced at the same time of the work presented in the MoMA show, but a very different conversation happening in the south of France versus United States post-war art academies. French culture was undergoing a major shift and profound changes during this period. Artists in the group were active participants in the protests surrounding anti-colonialism in Vietnam and Algeria. The artwork in this exhibit reflects the tensions and subtle gestures against consumerism and imperialism. The group was invested in learning craft skills that they felt were being lost. Next slide. So in closing, I'd like to present a quote from the great sculptor, late great sculptor, Magdalena Abacanovich, recently died a couple of years ago. This quote is called On Fibre. It's from 1978. I see fiber as the basic element constructing the organic world on our planet as the greatest mystery of our environment. It is from fiber that all living organisms are built, the tissue of plants, our cells, our nerves, our genetic code, the canals of our veins, our muscles. We are fibrous structures. See my hair. Our heart is surrounded by the coronary plexus, the plexus of the most vital threads. When handling fiber, we handle mystery. A dry leaf has a network reminiscent of a dry mummy. What can become of fiber, guided by the artist's hand and their intuition? What is fabric? We weave it, see it, shape it into forms. When the biology of our body breaks down, the skin has to be cut as to give access inside for repair. Our cut is then sewn like fabric. Fabric is our covering and our attire, made with our hands. It is a record of our souls. Thank you.
Wow, that was a very strong closing quote. I have a quick question for you, Camille, because I met you and you were the curator of contemporary art at the Textile Museum. So how, as a weaver and a practitioner, how do you navigate? And I found that very interesting that you decided to present those two exhibitions. So you still have, I'm sure you still feel very close to the museum work or the exhibitions world. So how do you navigate the weaving, the weaver in you, and then the curator and the curatorial practices?
Well, I had a good example. Called my father. My father was wanted to become a painter, and in the 1940s and 50s, his parents discouraged him. You're a black man, you're going to have a family, and you cannot feed your family as a painter. So we'll send you to engineering school. So my father became an aerospace design engineer, and he designed, in fact, the living quarters on the space shuttle program. I remember when that program began in the early 70s. But he always had an easel. He did macrame. He built a kiln in the backyard and was throwing pots. That it was part of your life. It was part like breathing, that you have a job, but you also create. So I felt I was an asset at the Textile Museum in the sense that I understood textile construction. So many art historians do not take studio courses. Mm-hmm. They don't know what the process is to apply paint to a canvas, the struggle of that. So because I've looked at so much art and worked for many years as a curator, not necessarily an institution, but for private collectors, there's a conversation about textiles as we define them in the fine art world, and that world does not cross over into the fiber art world. Case in point, there's a weaver by the name of Brett Wadden, who's based in Nova Scotia, Canada, or was trained there, and he's between Vancouver and I believe Berlin. And he presents his work as woven painting. And it's like the two worlds don't talk. So when I'm shopping for clients, high-end clients, I'm going into those gallery spaces and I'm looking at what's happening. I'm like, there's a conversation here that needs to happen around this. Again, the MoMA show clearly says textile, and work from the same time period says painting, deconstructed painting. So is it a matter of how you present yourself? And I'm struggling with that with my own work, trying to present it in a space that I feel most comfortable. And right now, this space is not ready to listen to me here in Detroit, locally. So, you know, maybe, you know, I'm going to go to LA, see if I can have someone show it there. But, you know, it's still in that spot. And I'm like, okay, there's another conversation going on, and I want to be a part of that conversation for a number of reasons. Because you're dealing with the same issues around color theory. You know, woven cloth, you know, you weave yellow with blue threads, and you're going to have purple visually from a distance. So you're dealing with the same kind of formal design principles. So, you know, why not have that conversation?
Yeah.
May I?
Yeah, I feel like Roxanne and Chloe have something to say too.
Well, so one of the things I have been doing for the past few years is teaching as an adjunct at George Mason, and I teach aesthetics, which is for art majors. It's not really a philosophy class so much as sort of exploring physical experience of art and art related things. And we have one of the conversations that I always bring up is this issue of craft versus art. And obviously, one of the things that I think is so interesting about it is that on the one hand, there is this, you know, prestige issue of, you know, sort of a hierarchy of fine art craft, you know, that especially for me coming from a fine art background was, you know, I'm very aware of. And certainly I want to just acknowledge, because I think there is, you know, the money and the institutions and the, you know, the sort of gravitas, the seriousness, all of that are weighted towards the fine art side. It's clearly, if you are in that world, it's above it. But on the other hand, one of the things that's interesting about the discussion is that I know plenty of people who consider themselves crafters and are not interested in being thought of as artists. So that there is this kind of noblesse oblige of artists being like, no, we want to welcome you guys up into the higher, you know, the pinnacle of creation up in the fine art world. And the crafters are like, you guys are weird. I don't know what you're doing. I'm not interested in that. I value my priorities in terms of what I'm making are completely different. And so I'm not interested in that. And so I think that one of the things that I've been really thinking a lot about and pursuing is how to come up with ways to think about the two areas that somehow take out the prestige, acknowledge, but remove the prestige aspect from it in a way of thinking about it. Because I think that there are really interesting aspects to the craft tradition as it's self-defined that I wouldn't want to throw out by just saying, I mean, of course, the work should all be given the same value. I mean, that to me is sort of the base given. But are there, if you go past that acknowledgement, are there distinctions that are worth preserving? And if so, what might they be? And I just think that's one of the interesting things about that question for me.
Those are two good questions to put out there. Yeah, we can come back to that discussion. And I think Chloe, you're next. So share screen. Okay.
Well, I have missed you, Camille. Just wanted to say quickly. You know, I think I really appreciate, I mean, obviously, like you talking about Abakanowitz, because I think like the way that she relates to physicality and the body, and I think there is sometimes, especially in fine art, this snobism as it relates to materiality, like that is not the realm of the contemporary artist. But yeah, I think a lot of the work that I'm interested in really has a lot to do with what you mentioned on text, and this way in which we create meaning and story through textile and through text, because they're historically linked through their etymology. And it's important to note that textile precedes text. So text is derived from the meaning in Latin for interwoven or interlaced, rather than the other way around. So material precedes thought. And I think that's one of the core kind of ways in which I treat textiles specifically, and also the ways in which history and textiles intertwine. So I started my relationship with textiles by working in fashion, actually. So I was a designer for a hot minute, and I think this relationship to the body and to being a body in space, and also your relationship to yourself and to your own history, as I mentioned earlier, is really one of the core kind of means of exploration. And a lot of the work that I do really starts with just picking up on a history or on some given kind of historical facts. So this piece, for example, which is one of the first like large scale tapestry pieces that I made, is really based on the history of stripes and striped garments as a tool for discrimination and separation of societies into different groups of people. And the basis for stripes as that tool comes from like a poor translation in the Old Testament from a material like a material made of two materials must not be worn to a material made of two colors must not be worn. And it created an entire kind of way of having uniforms symbolize that which is excluded or not accepted. So I took 13 shirts, deconstructed, and then rewoven into tapestries that spell out that phrase in Latin. And then I left the collars and the cuffs kind of hanging to kind of also make allusion to the ways in which bodies are impacted by texts across space and time. So the next one. And then just to kind of also talk about the fact that I don't just work with garments, but I also work with other materials that have some kind of encoded meaning. So I work a lot with Japanese paper, which is a material that allows you to actually draw or write onto it and then shred it into thread that can be woven as a tapestry. So all of these, the little specks of blue are actually text that's been written and then transformed into thread that becomes the tapestry surface. Next one. And then, you know, slowly, because I was working with garments, I think it was kind of a natural progression to think about performance and to consider textiles as they relate directly to the body. And even though I don't think I set out for a career in performance, it seems like that was the best way to make it personal and to also talk about how history as it relates to the body is transformed over time. So here I'm wearing a shirt with slang terms for Arab and Jew, which are terms that historically in my family have kind of grappled with. And then I'm undoing those words slowly and weaving them in the form of a backstrap loom. So slowly the textile gets made and the text on my back disappears. This one. And then it was interesting because those two tracks of working both with performance and then also weaving kind of came together as I started looking into how, you know, I could make a textile that speaks or that interacts in some way, or how the body could actually come alive through a textile by voice. So I really wanted to make textiles that talk. And one of the best ways to do that is actually by inserting conductive threads into textiles directly and create surfaces that are actually as interactive as your phone. So it's really the same principle. And one of the best technologies were developed by Google. So I actually just, I cold emailed them and I said, I love your technology. Let's do something together. And you know, they were like, yeah, oh, cool. So we started working together on how to make artworks with some of their technologies, and it gave way to this, which is a 7-paneled installation with tapestries that are woven here at the Tapestry Workshop in France. So I ended up working with some of the weavers here, and then also learning specifically how French tapestry is made to weave some myself. And all of the words are actually spelled out on white, so you don't see them, but you can only see them when you touch the words. And all of them relate to kind of the complicated and often conflicting symbolism around the color white. As a formal element, but also as a power structure. So on the next slide, you'll see kind of some of the tapestries. So you can see like some indications that there's something woven in, but not quite. And then on the next one, I wonder if you can play it. Oh, and this is just to kind of show some of the like technical aspects. I mean, I don't know if anyone's like a technical geek, but just to kind of show you, it's all of these little threads are woven into the tapestry, and then they're connected via this Arduino board to control kind of the outputs that comes out. And then maybe you can play it.
Alors, let's see.
Oh, I guess maybe you can't play it. Oh, that's too bad. So essentially, you can kind of see the ghost of it, but when you rub your hand across it, the textile both sings its own letter and also lights up from behind, so you can see each individual letter. So it creates this this way in which you can actually read through gesture. So even someone who's blind actually could come and technically read all of the words. And I think it was really interesting to create something that was heavily related to texture and to include texture in that gesture of reading, and kind of have this interactive component to language. So even within a word, you could create other words by, you know, touching many sounds at the same time. Oh, and I should also mention that some of the words, some of the letters were really like in pain. So I made sure, like I asked the composer, whose name is Caroline Shaw, to actually compose like painful sounds as well. So the tapestry would sometimes like shriek or have this kind of like not being able to breathe. And then this is the latest work that I've made, and it was, so all the places here during COVID are closed. I'm in Paris, and I decided to pitch to the National Library of Art History to record a performance within their space about family histories. And so I made a shirt with different areas. So all of the dark lettered areas are actually interactive. And so I touch different areas of my body, and different stories actually come out of those patches. And so there's a way in which, you know, the body itself becomes the vessel to kind of tell the history of the person wearing it. So you have English, which is on my collar, French on my shoulders, there's Hebrew songs on my forearms, and then a North African instrumental on my hips, because I have more distance. Like the culture that I'm less familiar with becomes more abstract and more instrumental, whereas like the one that's most clear is English, and it's close to my head and more easily reachable. So in the next one, you'll see just, this is kind of just like a large shot of kind of the ways in which it works. So you have little LEDs within the shirt, and then you also have all of the wiring that's hidden in the shirt, so you don't really see it. So yeah, had lots of
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's pretty impressive. Chloe, where do you see that it's that relationship between like the most ancient form of art, one of the most ancient form of art, now merging with, you know, technology? You started that with Google, right? And where do you see that going, and how do you see your work evolving? Are you only like focused on this, or yeah?
Oh, I mean, I to be honest, like I love working with engineers. Like they're so cool, and I think there's a way of like looking at the world that's really similar to the way that weavers look at the world. It's like structural, like there's just like a way of thinking that's very related to textile. And then when you actually like dig into the history of textiles and as it relates to the history of engineering, they're actually like deeply intertwined. You know, the first computer was based on jacquard loom systems. So you have this kind of very intertwined history. And I think craft and textiles have been largely omitted from the evolution of engineering. I think also for power structure reasons, the ways in which computer and engineering fields were developed after some of the inventions by NASA were solely outsourced to Asian and foreign countries for cheap, unpaid, and invisible labor to also put forward like more like, I guess, a masculine portrayed field. And I think it's interesting because there's this moment now where, you know, like wearable technologies are becoming extremely present. And it's a really interesting time to be working more with that material. I think it poses immense, interesting metaphorical, you know, like representations. And I'm not interested in, you know, I have this conversation with tech companies also, like I'm really fascinated by like using their tools as a tool. Like, I think it's not, I'm not interested in creating like something that can then be like created as a product. Like, I think I'm more like an experimenter in that field. But I also think that the deeply like social and like that culture of care and of touch and like, I don't know, sensation also needs to be part of the dialogue in engineering, because, you know, textiles aren't just a technology, they're also social movements. They're also like, they're so connected to everything. And so it's nice to be part of that field. Otherwise it's just like a lot of dudes in a lab, like making you know.
Yeah, and we've seen that in fashion too. We've seen that a lot with Hussein Chalayan, with Alexander McQueen. They've, you know, and this is 10 years ago. Like, so
I can't believe it. Yeah,
I mean,
what they did.
Interaction. Last but not least, Roxana, I have your presentation ready, so I will share the screen. Thank you all for being so fast and sharing your presentations. Here we go. Good? Oh, you have to unmute. Mute.
Sorry, thank you. Okay, you can go to the next one. That's my name. I just, my title page. So yeah, I just want, sorry, oh gosh, they're a little blurry. I'm so sorry. I was struggling to get it to a definition that I could send to you easily, so I apologize.
It's okay. Thank you for doing that. Sorry about this.
Yeah, sure. No. So I just wanted to kind of talk about a brief section of my work. I started off, I trained as a painter, and I worked as a painter for a long time. And sort of, I came up at a time when it felt like, you know, you picked a discipline and you stuck with it, and then you developed expertise, and that was, then you were stuck with that forever. And so I felt moving away from painting was very stressful at the time, although now it seems really dumb that I was so worried about it. But I started this work in 2016 after the election, and I started making dissent collars after reading a brief news article about Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg she has a collar. Probably everybody knows this by now, but at the time it was new to me. She has lots of different collars that she would wear with her robes, and she has one that she wears when she's reading a dissent. And she wore it the day after the presidential election as a political gesture. And I was so fascinated by that gesture because it seemed like such a clever combination of kind of she was using the fact that we tend to minimize things like fashion and accessories as unimportant, but also using that, that traditional response to those gestures as a way of making a very serious point and making it known. And I thought it was such a brilliant combination of kind of sort of using this innocuous thing to do something quite serious, which is to register her political response to this election. And so I started making dissent collars, although mine were more just kind of, gestures of, on my part, I felt sort of initially like futility and frustration and grief and, rage and all the things that we were feeling at the time. And so I made a series of them and I would post them on Instagram, and I ended up making about 25 of them. And I am showing this one only because, as I said in the beginning, that one of the things that I'm interested in mostly about textiles, or what draws me to them, is their relationship, as both of Camille and Chloe have mentioned, of course, to the body and the way that they affect our movement, our sense of our bodies, but also the way that they seem to also record the absence of the body when we're not in them, or they're not on us. That there's this twinning that happens where you see a garment particularly, and it immediately evokes the body. And so I was making these collars without really thinking about the body initially, but then as I continued to make them, I was thinking more and more about sort of how I felt in my body and what these things that I was making affected me. And it was interesting that they were collars, because a collar has its own, very loaded, complicated series of associations of restriction and, in various, both sort of consensual and non-consensual ways. And so I was struck by that. And this piece is called Breastplate, and it came months after the election when I was feeling particularly enraged. And I ended up showing this work in several different contexts. And as part of my initial exhibition, I took a series of studio self-portraits of myself wearing the pieces. And I put both these photographs up to show that some of the kind of conflicting physical experiences that I was having with these objects, that both feeling powerless and also feeling empowered, and the way that, a breastplate is armor, but also, since mine is made out of it's hard to see in this, but studio trash, basically plastic and bits of pieces and stuff. So it doesn't really function as armor, but it felt like armor. Anyway, so I was interested in exploring the different variations of empowerment or disempowerment that one can associate with a garment. So then if you could move on to the next one. So after I had done that Dissent Collar series, I began thinking I wanted to continue working along sort of more political lines, but I wanted to kind of go into a deeper, slower series of thoughts, thinking about it and thinking more about sort of our history, how we got where we are. The descent colors were initially like just very reactive, very quick. And I wanted to make something that was kind of a slower examination of our history. And so I come from a long line of very waspy Puritan types. And so I started trying to re-examine my own family's history in America as a way of, as a lens of examining particularly the history of race in America. And my family, my mother's family I was looking at particularly, includes many abolitionists and sort of moral reformers. So the family narrative in my family had always been that, you know, we were on the right side of these issues, and, you know, we're proud to have stood up for the right things. But what I had always felt was complicated about that narrative was that it didn't acknowledge the tremendous privilege that had just accrued over generations of being here, and the ways in which my family, although, you know, moral crusaders, had also participated and benefited from the power structures of, you know, white supremacy that our country is based on. And so I started this piece. It's the foundation fabric is a bedspread that was my great grandmother's. And it's called the Cloak of Unfair Advantage. And the idea was that it's also a little bit of a reference to role-playing video games, which I was involved with at the time. And so the idea was that it was sort of a magic object that you could put on and invoke white privilege. That was sort of my thinking about it. And you can't, it's hard to see in these images, but at the base, there are these iron wrenches. And I was interested in the idea that of trying to be very overt and acknowledging that, you know, this history, the history of white privilege is always contains an awareness, however much it pretends often not to, of the history that it drags behind, that it's weighted down by this history of privilege and however, you know, inadvertent or whatever oppression. So this was the first of this series, and then you can go ahead, yeah. And then this is the second one. This is called The Genteel Gown of Feminine Blindness. And I made this piece based on the diaries of another ancestor of mine, a woman who was from Baton Rouge, and she ended up publishing her diaries of during the Civil War were published. And she was an interesting person to read about because she was, on the one hand, wrote very movingly, I thought, about her rage at being deprived of the same educational opportunities as her brothers and her frustration with the sort of feminine role that she was expected to play. And there were passages reading these journals where I felt this incredible proximity to her, like, you know, that we were somehow had met through this long stretch of time and culture and background. But then, of course, as you might expect, there were also passages in which her just complete blindness to the profound racism and oppression that she is just referring to casually, not brutally necessarily, but without any kind of recognition, was so not shocking, but terrible to read. And there was a third component in which she writes about being a young woman dealing with the Confederate soldiers and how they were, on the one hand, they were these, you know, young heroes, and they were, you know, we were so proud of our boys or whatever. And then, but there were also passages where she casually mentions how it sounded like what a baseline of fear there was among the women in her household of the soldiers, that, you know, for her to venture, she ventured out on a balcony without a veil, and it caused an uproar in the household because she had exposed all of them to risk. And I was so interested again in these kind of failures to acknowledge and mention these systems that she was involved in, both as a, you know, she was both oppressed and the oppressor in her own way. And this sort of, it, you know, made me think about, of course, what ways am I blind to the ways that I participate in systems of oppression now, and how, you know, how often we don't notice where it is that we're standing. And so this piece is, it also contains family objects, just some like family tea towels, and there's embroidery, and a number of different materials there, both my own embroidery and others. So you can go to the next one. And then this is a more current one that I made for an exhibition. This was last fall, that was supposed to be about, I mean, it was about, the exhibition was about parenting, mothering specifically during quarantine. And my initial response to that proposition was to try to develop practices that were kind of daily journalistic practices, because it was such a difficult time, and also because I was with my family. I have 3 children. You know, we were all together, and so I couldn't develop kind of a full conceptual studio practice. I wanted something that was portable and methodical, meditative, and sort of small. And so I had started embroidering this coat, which had just been a practice. I was practicing a pattern on old studio drop cloths. So I started embroidering it every day as a kind of journalistic practice. And then after the murder of George Floyd, I embroidered his name, and then Breonna Taylor's name. And then I was, you know, it was like so many people just so consumed with the names, these names of the dead, names of the murdered, and that it felt like I couldn't really make any other marks. There were no other marks that I was able to make. And in other pieces, I researched and was looking at names of people of color were murdered by police. But in this instance, I decided that I was thinking so much about women of color that were friends initially. I mean, I was initially thinking about my friends and reaching out to them, but also thinking about women of color that I have debts of gratitude towards, and who have been instrumental in my life. And so I started embroidering their names on this coat. And yeah, so that happens, you know, you can see this on the back. And then below that, I was trying to think of a way to include my own, to connect it to this family history that I had been working on before. And I did it initially, and then started tearing it out. And the more I started tearing out, the more that seemed to be the right thing. So it ended up being kind of completely shredded and then rewoven. And I ended up feeling like that was a good metaphor for sort of the instability of, you know, this terrible system that we are finding ourselves, you know, balancing on top of, and struggling to rebuild, even as it kind of collapses beneath us. So that is that piece. And I think that's might be the end. Oh, so this is one last piece from that quarantine show. And this is just it's a roller towel. And the red and blue I embroidered. We sat down as a family and had a family meeting about sort of how we were going to tackle quarantine. And I wrote up a little sheet that we, you know, and posted on the refrigerator. So I ended up embroidering that on the roller towel. But as I went along, and as quarantine went along, this sort of, you know, soundtrack of try not to worry, of me reassuring my children, while at the same time constantly trying to contain my own anxiety about the consequences of the epidemic, was getting larger and larger. And so I was embroidering it on this fabric as sort of it went along. But included this not so much as a garment, but as a, again, I was thinking about the body, and that, this was this way of relating, and that the sort of irony of a roller towel being like such a germ infested object. Which I thought was kind of funny. But anyway, so so I think that's all I've sent.
Thank you so much, Roxana. It's that's when was the COVID exhibition? Where was it shown? Was it in DC?
Yeah, it was at the Brentwood Art Center, the Gateway Art Center. Unfortunately, they were never allowed to open.
Okay.
So there was a video talk that was posted, and it was up and installed. It's a great show. Jackie Millad and Amy Hughes Braden were the other two. There were 3 artists.
Okay.
And there is a really good sort of video and panel discussion of the whole show, but we were never allowed to open it.
I mean,
sorry, go ahead.
No, excuse me. Go.
The Cloak of Unfair Advantage, the one with the red rope, is actually currently at the Krieger Museum as part of their show Traces. And so that's open, I think, until May. They just reopened it. So anyway.
It's a wonderful show. I saw that one, and you couldn't see a lot. You have more than one piece there. What I love about your work, beside the fact that it's so impactful and talks a lot at a personal level too. I mean, you're kind of rewriting a lot of also your history and the history of your family and we had that conversation when we first met. You're using a lot of discarded material.
Yes.
And it's not only wires, but it's zip, like the plastic zip. I don't know how you call those in English.
Yeah, the zip ties.
The zip ties. And is that something that, that you started like this, like it's part of your practice too, to kind of reuse what is available and, kind of merge it also with your family artifacts? And
yes. So I am very much somebody who, my practice is built on like jury rigging things. I like to, because I'm impulsive and, I'm like, oh, I could just make it work with these 3 things that I have here, rather than go and get the actual proper tool or material that would really make it work. I get stuck trying to come up with solutions to dumb problems, basically. So it's partly that, but I also, I am really drawn to objects. I have a kind of deeply animistic sense that they have their own power and presence and personality, and particularly objects that have been used, even if they're discards. I mean, scraps of wood. I'm, a weird person, haunting the sides of construction sites or, dumpsters. My eyes light up and I'm like, oh, can I get, this little cast off piece of wood that got thrown away or whatever. There's something about the kind of accident that happens that I find deeply, deeply exciting. And it's much less interesting to me if I am in control of every part of the process. So if I can collect objects that have already been broken or formed or shaped or changed or stained, then I'm giving them control and responsibility for themselves, and then I can work with that. It sort of allows me to be a collaborator rather than a controller of the whole process in some ways. Yeah. So I wish I could claim that I was being virtuous on a sustainability. I would love to. I do think about that, and I do work on that and think about how I can increasingly be more sustainable in my practice and in my life in general. But it more comes from a kind of greedy like interest in the objects themselves than it does a true moral virtuous sustainability.
Well, it works.
It's very important. I'm not trying to. I don't want to claim, right. But
I want just to see if anyone has a question, because wow, we're perfect on timing. Does anyone have a question for Chloe, Camille, or Roxana? Or if you guys have a question, I also want you to kind of, if you want to share something about a future exhibition, about a a published text or anything, you can also do that.
Camille, would you list your text in the chat so I can remember the article that you had just mentioned?
And Chloe, can you also, I mean, if you want to share the video that we couldn't see, if it's online, we can share that. Willie Smith, I remember that one. And Roxana, can you share is it is that exhibition still virtual? Can we still see it online?
The Brentwood one? Yes, I think I will I will check again. I think I have it posted on my website, but I can also, I'll send you see if I can find the link. They posted it, I think, on Facebook, but you can get it other ways. So I'll see if I can track it down. Yeah.
Okay. And the Krieger Museum, I think, is open. Yes, Camille.
Oh, go ahead. Finish your thought.
No, I'm just going to share the exhibition Faces at the Krieger Museum.
Just wanted to highlight the article. It's called Knowledge Through the Hand. And it's really about the materiality of the thread itself and the choices that Willie Smith made, right down to even the spin of the yarn to affect the drape of the cloth for his fashions. So the show is still up at the Cooper Hewitt in New York. I did lend a piece for the exhibition. I loved Willie Smith's clothes when I was in high school in the late 70s. And you could just run your hand down the rack, I remember, and you could land on his clothes because of the hand, the way it felt in your hand. And it's the beginning of the introduction of polyester, big time, as a solution to not ironing. And my mother was real big on that. She hated ironing, so she bought all these polyester clothes for me, which I loathed. And I knew that I would get 100% fiber, natural fiber garment with Willie Smith. Did not believe in polyester or synthetic dyes, none of that. So he was well ahead of his time on many levels. So it was great pleasure. I kind of I was tickled writing it because I thought, here's this teenage girl shopping for clothes, never thinking that I would write an essay in a catalog about his work. So that's that.
Well,
I just wanted to follow up. I don't know if anybody has a question in the chat. I see Julia's here. Hi, Julia. You know, the issue of positioning of, you know, high, low, craft versus fine art, and all of the above. It feels, I just see the techniques happening all over, and just to call it out for what it is, that looks like crochet to me. You know, when you see a huge Ernesto, can't think of his last name right now, out of Brazil, piece, an installation, it's crochet. And, you know, the people are all under it and enjoying it because it's so accessible, it's so familiar. And, you know, it's just a matter of where you position your work, where you're going to feature it. I feel very strongly about craft. My school, California College of Arts and Crafts, they dropped the word craft from the name of the school. And the craft artists were not happy about this. And I let the president know every time I see him of the college, that was not nice. And so I understand those conversations. I'm observing what's going on. And maybe, you know, for people to insert themselves in a conversation that relates more to what they're doing. I know there are craft activists that have these, you know, yarn bombings and what have you. And, you know, that's one dialogue. Why can't Ernesto be part of that dialogue as well? Why can't they be inserted to a dialogue with him? So I think textiles right now is the rage. It's a big deal right now. So I think people, especially of your generation here in the United States, they eliminated art education programs. Bam, 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 bam. So you have a whole group of professionals, millennials, and the next generation below in their 20s who've never had the exposure. So when they see ceramics, or right now, before COVID, the ceramic studios in Brooklyn were booming. So these young people are sitting in front of a screen all day long on their job, and they need to do something with their hands at the end of the day or on weekends. So there's this growing appreciation for the craft media. And, and why not insert conversation from support and surfaces into that this is, we're looking at the concept of painting from a different perspective. That's fine. So I think it's an opportunity to be postmodern, and and why not just go for it, and just make the conversation happen instead of waiting for it to develop or waiting for someone to come and ask you about it. So that's my final comment.
I think it's, sorry, I hope it's okay. Just, I wanted to add that it's, just in contrast, we have in France, like a very powerful craft presence. Like these are, the tapestry workshop is like funded by the state. This is like a state affair to preserve the craftsmanship of the country. And so there's a very, very powerful segmentation between the visual artists and the craftspeople. Like all of the tapestries are based on paintings. There are no tapestries that are based on material works. Even Sheila Hicks, who they wove, it was a painting that she did, which I find like hilarious. But I think there's also like a lot of great space for like the United States, and the fact that there isn't as much of this education because there's a little bit more of an openness perhaps to like some of the new things that are coming along. And sometimes like it's not perfectly well made, or like it's not perfectly in line with the tradition, but it's contributing something really important.
Yeah. Well, on that beautiful note, thank you all again so much. So nice to see you. Chloe, Camille, come see us in DC. We miss you. Roxana, let's have coffee. And everyone, thank you so much for attending. Thank you again. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to us, info@thisistribute.com. Otherwise, I wish you all a wonderful Friday. And